Okay, I just wanted to record a little bit of a presentation here on the final group project. I'm just presenting the slides that are posted on Sakai. I've modified them slightly in this latter part of the course, but for the most part they're the same as they've been up there since the beginning of the course, talking about the group project. But I didn't want to necessarily take up class time to go over this because for many of you, it would be unnecessary. I think maybe you can understand exactly what I'm asking for, but I don't want to assume that's the case, and so I want to offer this up, this presentation of me going through these slides for anybody who would benefit from or would desire some additional sort of insight. And maybe the way it works out is that one person from each group watches this, and so that not everybody, all of our 50 plus students need to actually go through this, and we save ourselves and save our class time for some more valuable discussions. So anyway, the idea here is that of the class project or the final group project, is that basically I want you to apply the course concepts to a defense sector or public sector organization. So, a lot of our case studies, although of course we've had, the U.S. Postal Service case study, the MPS, the MBA at MPS case study, the DARPA case study, a number of public sector or defense context case studies. I want to be sure that the lessons have resonated with you in a way that allows you to actually apply them in the defense context, in your context, in the public sector context. So I want you to apply it, these concepts to a public sector, defense sector organization of your choosing. My only requirements are that it indeed be, like I say, public sector or Navy or DoD. And I've posted a number of examples of previous projects that are, pretty good, all of them. Some of them are excellent, on Sakai. And I do ask that you not repeat or analyze a command or organization that's already been analyzed in any of the example projects. Um, the length is anywhere from 10 to 20 pages, and that's including exhibits. And I'll go over exhibits, extensively, because I think a picture's worth 1,000 words sometimes, and it helps frame what you'll be writing about. But I want you to exclude endnotes in terms of references or anything else. And in fact, those are not counted in the 20 pages limit, because frankly, I want to strongly encourage those, because things like the DARPA case study, the MBA at MPS case study, the U.S. Postal Service case study, all of those emanated from student projects initially. And therefore, if I want to be able to, if your project is something that I think other students could learn from in the future and therefore become a case study, I want to be sure to be able to get to the references that you may have used. So anyway, I basically, this is due, the final project is due by midnight on June 30th. Why June 30th? Well, basically, I wanted to give you all the time I could, but I didn't want it to go into the next quarter. So if and an easy date to remember is the last day of June. I know you don't start again until after the 4th of July, and my grades are shortly due thereafter. But basically, you're welcome to turn it in, anytime. But make sure it's done in June. I think June 30th is sort of a easy to remember sort of deadline. And just to send it to me electronically. Students have sent it in Word format. Some have sent it in PDF format. Others have sent, 2 files. Maybe they've sent or multiple files, something in Microsoft Word, which is their text, some diagrams that were in PowerPoint as a separate submission, accompanying the Word document. Others have submitted Excel spreadsheets with data in there. So, but if you want to copy and paste and put it all into a PDF or a Word document, that's fine as well. So the idea here is that I'd like the groups to be about 3 to 5 students. And I've sort of given guidelines based on, at least at some point, what the count was in each location of what I'm sort of thinking in terms of the number of groups from each location. And so I'd like you to go ahead and, form your own groups, and I'll talk in a second. I want you to do that and let me know who's in each group. Now, I have been willing to have bigger than 5 students. I've been willing to have, fewer than 3 students. I would discourage that, though. When I do have, and regardless, if there's going to be 6 students, I expect it to reflect the work of 6 students as opposed to 3 students. So I'm not going to grade everything on the same scale, so it's to your benefit to not have too large of a group. I know diffuses the responsibility, but it also does, I do raise the bar. I'm not going to it would otherwise be unfair to compare a group of 3 students to a group of 6 students, on an even playing field. Basically, what I want, a little bit free in this regard, and I thought about refining it some, but I really want to see you just apply the concepts from the course. So this includes basic description. Keep in mind, I'm not going to know all these organizations. You'll have to, simply even for my own information to understand basically what the organization is that you're analyzing. And then we're going to sort of go through sort of what we've done in the course. First, of course, the external analysis, understand the organization's environment, identify the organization's strategy or strategic position, and sometimes it may be that you think they don't have a strategy, and you'd have to sort of explain why that's the case. But if they do have a strategy, you sort of identify what you think it is or what it is, which may or may not be, by the way, of course, what's in their public strategy documents. Then sort of internal analysis of the organization activity system, evaluation of the organization's external and internal alignment, recommendations for increasing or sustaining alignment. So what really the recommendations of what do you think they should do going forward. And because of the timing, you certainly are welcome to do some of the dynamic analysis that we do in this last module, the threats to sustained advantage, things like that. But you're not required. I don't expect that, and because otherwise, I want you to be able to start working on the group project, before the very end of the course. And so I really only ask you to apply things that are up through the internal analysis module. Exhibits. It's something that I think visually very helpful to tell a story visually, and then you can sort of frame your your text analysis around those. And so any sort of complementary visual analyses, it doesn't have to be what I present here, but I've seen many different things. It can be data, diagrams, charts, graphs, illustrations. Even though we have a certain way of doing internal analysis, if your organization has an org chart, include the org chart or any other data or these sorts of things. I mean, I'm big on exhibits. I'm big on numbers. I'm big on sort of seeing the proof in the pudding as opposed to just talking about it. And so understanding any sort of data or exhibits you might have that would help me better understand the organization you're analyzing and better explain your conclusions would be very helpful. What are some examples of exhibits? Well, I'm going to go through a bunch of them, in a minute. I've got a bunch in this presentation, and these are just giving you ideas. How best. Remember, your objective here is to analyze the organization, but also to obviously this is for a course, so you want to show me that you've learned things in the course, and show me how you can apply what we've done. So, and you'll see that students have done that in different ways in the past. There's a whole bunch of project examples posted on Sakai, that are already up there. They've been up there for the whole quarter. The good news is that gives you a lot of guidance and what students have done in the past, and these are all ones that I think were good. Some of them were great, but of course the downside is that these are off the table. I don't want anybody to do an analysis of these organizations again, and some of these are commands where I have students repeatedly, and so that's bad news for some students because that means that they can't analyze their own command because it's already been done. There's others that have been done that aren't necessarily, the whole analyses aren't posted on Sakai. For example, I'm about to go through some exhibit examples, and I'll probably put up some exhibits from some cases that aren't on this list. So I haven't given you the entire analysis, but I might give you one exhibit in what follows. Now, you're welcome to go ahead and analyze that organization, but of course, obviously, I will be conscious of the fact that if I've already given you a little bit of a head start here on some of these, so the ones on this list are sort of off limits, and some of the other ones that may come up in the exhibits or the diagrams that are to follow, they're not off limits. You can analyze those, but I might be expecting you to take it a step further than students did in the past. And the fact that I might be showing you an exhibit from one of those presentations, but it's not, or one of those projects, but it's not posted on Sakai, means that I expected something more. There's more to be gotten out of that analysis. Deadlines. So this is new information in some sense, and the June 30th deadline is always there, but I do have two what I will call soft deadlines before that. So basically, I want to encourage people going on the right path. So the first thing is, of course, to identify your group members. So if you could, everybody email me and, by June 5th, that's this Friday, and again, these are soft deadlines, but I just want to keep people on pace, so I know what all the groups are and everybody's got a group and things like that. And then a week from Friday, which is the Friday after our last day of class, sort of before we sort of lose touch, I'd like to know what organization you were analyzing. And I can maybe give you some guidance if I think it's going to be problematic. If I think you're off track, if I don't think it satisfies the requirements of the assignment, or you unknowingly are repeating one of the examples I've already posted, or whatever, I can sort of say, oh, that's not going to work. But again, that gives us some time before the deadline to make mid-course corrections here for the June 30th deadline. So, all right. So then the rest of what I've sort of got here is I've just wanted to show you some examples. Beyond, of course, I've got, as I've shown here, some complete examples, text and everything posted on Sakai. But just some examples of, sort of exhibits that students have done in the past, and some ideas that in some cases the students haven't done, but just putting out there as ideas of what you could do. Because again, I think a picture for me is really worth 1,000 words, and what I think has to happen is these pictures don't tell the whole story. So typically, even the diagrams I'm showing you, I'm expecting the students then to tell me what does it mean, right? But it is helpful in telling the story. So the one common one that I get a lot of is that students almost always do is something along sort of an external interdependency map. And you may remember that I talked about these ideas of identifying the different interdependencies, external interdependencies that the organization has with those around it, then analyzing those in terms of their incentives, their information, their interdependence, then thinking about the implications. What does that mean for positioning, for opportunities and threats, and changes, these sorts of things. So again, the map itself is just a piece of the story. It just sort of tells you the basic, who the players are in their basic story. But ultimately, of course, the text goes deeper into the analysis. Here's an example of the, Commander Helicopter C Combat Wing U.S. Pacific Fleet. Here's just an example of a, straight out of the template that I did as students doing an external analysis. There's another one, Training Air Wing 5, Whiting Field. So again, you get the idea. A lot of examples here. HSM Weapons School, Pacific Fleet, NAVC. Again, you'll see that in each case we have sort of the different external players, external interdependencies that are significant, and a summary of sort of the incentives, information, interdependence issues. Now, again, the text of the projects themselves will go into more detail on these things, and really, this exhibit or diagram in and of itself is not sufficient for an external analysis. And then, of course, you've also got to ultimately say the implications are. What does that mean? Again, CNIC Commander's Navy Installations Command. Here's a Joint Base Anacostia Bowling Child Youth Programs. And so you'll see, again, there's a lot of different examples here to give you an idea of, what you might have an organization that's like one of these, and give you some idea of things to look at. I'm not necessarily, I've tried to weed out the, the bad ones, but these are of varying quality, I would say. But it certainly at least can give you some ideas. People do, different looks, to these things as well. And again, like I said, these are sort of motivating, ultimately, a deeper analysis in the text of the project. All right, so you can go through and you can look at the different examples here. Like I said, there's a lot of these external interdependency maps. This is one that's a little different, and this whole JADO analysis is one of the examples posted on Sakai. But they actually, you'll see here, there's actually 3 different diagrams that this group did for external analysis. One of them was this one here, which is simply basically sort of identifying the external interdependencies. And classifying them. You see there sort of in the blue, or industry or market relationships, or non-market relationships, so different sort of identification. But then beyond identification, they went through included this exhibit as well, which was the more important or significant external interdependencies, and going into more detail in terms of the incentives, information interdependence of those. So again, but a lot of the projects include something along these lines. Now, you can also do, sort of a five forces analysis, straight up five force analysis type of analysis exhibit if it works for your organization. Again, here is the sort of standard sort of way to analyze each of the five forces. Here are the five forces. And when it comes to sort of the defense context, the reality is that it's certainly possible to use a direct application of the 5 or 6 forces in the defense context, and it gives you some ideas here of, figuring out who your rivals might be, so this sort of identifies, who you might be looking at as in considering rivals or existing competitors, who might be potential new entrants, what might be substitutes, what might be your suppliers, your employees, your contractors, suppliers of technology, etc. Who might be the customers, and these usually again in two types of customers, the users and the funders. Who might be the complements if you're going to do sort of the 6 forces. And so you certainly can do it. And some students have done it successfully. Others have, been more difficult. Because I do sort of feel like it's a little like forcing a round peg into a square hole if you are forcing the 5 forces analysis upon any organization, because it works very well, in certain contexts, and others it doesn't. Here are some examples. Here's a work that people did on OASIS, the Overcoming Adversity and Stress Injury Support. And did sort of identify the 5 forces for that organization or that program, and we're able to get some mileage out of that. Here is again JATO. I already showed you 2 different external analyses exhibits that they did. They also sort of put in the 5/6 forces analysis here, and sort of understanding. You'll see here, this is really just identifying. It's not really the analysis itself. It's sort of an exhibit to accompany the analysis. But again, you can do a sort of 5 force analysis. In some cases it works. Some cases it is appropriate. Some cases, it may not. And that's part of the lesson of that module, is that in the end it doesn't really matter the framework. It's still going to be about identification, incentives, information, interdependency, implications. Another thing you could do, and I haven't had any students do this, but I'm just putting it out there as we talked about, you certainly could do a SWOT analysis. You could do some sort of diagram of the SWOT analysis, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. I haven't had students do that, but you certainly could do it. And it would, here we talked about the pros and cons of it, so it does leave some things lacking, but if you can demonstrate your ability to add on to that, where the SWOT analysis sort of leaves you, it's sort of focused so much more on identification than analysis. But if you have the identification here in a SWOT sort of matrix, and then are able to do the analysis more deeply in your text, then that would be great. Another idea that, again, I haven't had students do before, because these readings are relatively new, but we emphasized a lot of these readings. The one on the perils of bad strategy, we talked about the kernel of good strategy. The other reading on do you know what your strategy is? We talked about the elements of a strategy statement, right? And so again, these might be helpful as well. Maybe you can talk about the diagnosis of the challenge, especially coming on the end of the external analysis, the objective, right? And certainly ideas of scope, advantage, and the activities, are things that that would be natural. And maybe, again, I have not had students do this. Maybe some sort of exhibit like this, where you actually filled out the why, where, what, and how, or summarize them. Maybe that would help tell the story. I'd have to see an example of a student doing it and see if it's a good idea or not. But I figured I'd put it out there because it's something we've emphasized this year. Now, one of of course, the where here is, of course, the issue of scope. And I've had a lot of projects do good exhibits on scope. Remember that scope is about sort of, choosing, the most basic idea is to think about it in terms of choosing your product or services that you offer, the channels or locations, or the customers or users you serve. And we gave examples, for example, of Coors, and saw how what their product or service scope was, or channel or location scope, or the customer or user scope. And so you could do an exhibit like this if you wanted to sort of identify the scope. Here's another one that we did for the MPS GSBPP, and their scope, our scope, in terms of product or services, channels, locations, customers, or users. But one way to sort of define scope is just simply to instead of sort of a list, just listing it here, is really to think about it in terms of what you do and what you don't do, because scope is saying sort of what the boundaries are of what you do. And so using a template like this and creating an exhibit is another thing a lot of students have done, and you'll see some examples here. I, of course, here's the that from before, here's the NPS GSBPP, but here's the same, but in that format where I have the scope dimension and what they do and don't do. I gave you, here's a student example of the Littoral Combat Ship Program, and what they do in terms of their product or service scope, customer user scope, channel location scope, the students, and again, I'm not presenting any of these as being right or wrong in terms of the conclusions, but sort of give you an idea of the approach that students have used and that you could use to define the scope. Here's another one for the Washington Metro. I had some Washington, D.C. students, look at the Washington Metro and do an analysis. And here's a definition of the scope of what Washington Metro Service does and doesn't do. Here's the Naval Air Warfare Center Training Systems Division. Again, scope dimension, then what they do or they emphasize, and what they don't do or de-emphasize. Strike Fighter Squadron 122, that's VSF 122. Again, different scope dimensions. And by the way, the scope dimensions may or may not be product, services, customers, users. It may not fall into that category, and there may be a more natural or different way. We looked at DARPA in terms of the technologies, in terms of the applications, and those are all sort of different ways to define scope. Here's another potential exhibit that will capture something that I've not had a lot of students do, and that's understandable because it doesn't always fall right into your lap. But remember, in terms of one way to represent sort of this idea of advantage, the value proposition. Remember, we talked about this idea of, I gave you this about value creation and capture in the public sector, and figuring out your benefit or willingness to pay, of your user or funders, your supplier opportunity costs, and again about trying to figure out how wide of a wedge do you drive between the willingness to pay and supplier opportunity costs, because that really is the definition of competitive advantage or comparative advantage, and added value. And so I've had students, so here, for example, the students who did the Washington Metro, they obviously really, the idea of not a lot of value being captured by Metro, and the budget issues there, primarily because of, they argued that there was high supplier bargaining power or high customer bargaining power, and really squeezing, what Metro could get. But again, here's one way to represent that. And if this works for the organization you analyze, then great. If it tells a story, use it to tell a story. But again, I didn't have a lot of students. More often, when we think about the issue of advantage, what I get is a lot of students doing a lot of student projects on this idea of the balance of advantages, identifying advantages that their organization, different capabilities for which they face trade-offs, and how they balance them relative to other organizations. Here's an example that I gave you about the positions of U.S. military units, balanced in terms of sustained combat presence versus speed of engagement. Here's a student project, again, that JADO project. They measured sort of quality versus cost, or quality timeless versus cost, and where they positioned them along that productivity frontier. Here's a Naval Sea Systems Command, and again, to understand really what they're doing here, you'd have to understand, you read the project to understand. And I don't, there, like I said, there's people have used it in different ways, but they've used it to tell their story. Here's the Naval Air Warfare Center Training Systems Division. Again, a little different, rather than positioning different organizations or positioning different, training options. Here's the U.S. Naval Academy case study, and in terms of differentiation and cost and positioning relative to other schools or alternatives, both the other military academies as well as other public schools, UCLA, UVA, UNC. Here's the OASIS, the Overcoming Adversity and Stress Injury Support, sort of therapy effectiveness on the vertical axis, patient throughput on the horizontal axis, and different options, and also, in this case, OASIS had either large cohorts or small cohorts, and they were different positions, in this space. Here's an example, not of comparing different organizations, but this was the HSM Weapons School Pacific Fleet. And about, remember what I said is sometimes you define yourself relative to your previous position. And so this is the idea of a movement in the positioning of the HSM Weapons School in terms of moving more towards advanced tactic development and less towards the baseline fleet sustainment, right? And that's a movement along the productivity frontier, which is again a strategic positioning choice. Just again, the diagram helped illustrate that. Others, you'll see some of these here, by the way, we talked before about it's not always about balancing just two advantages. Sometimes you've got to talk about balancing, more than two advantages, in which case you may want to have, more than one of these diagrams to really capture the strategic positioning. And here's the, for example, the work done on Patrol Squadron 30. They did both a balancing the quality of training versus speed of training, the different programs, as well as the tactics focus versus the NATOPS focus. Again, so two different diagrams, same organization, but capturing the positioning of the different programs there. Here's one, again, for the Commander Naval Installations Command, Navy Installations Command. Again, both the different sort of, here balancing sort of the level of control versus the enterprise cost, and again, it matched into their story, but you can sort of, they had this diagram here in terms of the productivity frontier in those two dimensions, but another one in terms of operational flexibility versus enterprise cost. And again, where in this case, in this particular diagram, it's about where Scenic was pre-2003, where they wanted to be, where the reality is of where they've had to be. And so again, if the diagram helps you tell your story, then use it. A picture can be worth 1,000 words. Here's another one example, the Joint Base Anacostia Bolden Child Youth Programs. Again, they included two different trade-offs here. One in terms of relative accessibility, so the youth programs at JBAB versus civilian options, the relative accessibility versus parental affordability. Here's the standard of care versus corporate cost. Again, the JBAB versus the civilian care. You can see, again, to capture their position relative to the civilian options or the private sector options, they really had to have these two different diagrams which sort of capture the story. So again, it may be one may tell your story, two may tell your story, maybe this is not the way you want to tell your story. But again, I'm giving it as an option of helping tell the story you're trying to tell and demonstrate what you're trying to demonstrate. One that I don't expect a lot of, but I do have an example of here is, students actually went beyond just sort of this diagram to, here's an example of the HSM Weapons School Pacific Fleet, sort of both in terms of potential value created, the substitute positions, the customer positions, this idea of identifying where they were positioned along the frontier and why, right, based on these different variables. Again, this is the only time I've only had one student project do this, but it certainly is a option, something that you could capture, could tell your story. If it doesn't tell your story, then great, use it to tell your story. Again, I'm just putting these all out there as examples. A lot of these, so a lot of students do the internal activity system map. It makes sense. It's something we went over. It's not too hard for you to do. And this sort of covers the how, of these key two questions in terms of the set of coherent actions or activity system. And remember, I talked about the different process about, identifying all the major activity areas, assessing the incentives, determining the information, assessing interdependence, mapping them out. But again, remember, this diagram is just going to be a tool or part of the story. You certainly have to, it doesn't capture everything. It captures you're supposed to sort of identify the major activity areas, particularly where it's unique and distinct and interrelated with other activities. But then really the analysis, for the most part, obviously is not contained in the exhibit. It's contained in your written analysis. But here are just some examples. Here's Naval Medical Center in San Diego. Again, activity system map. NASA, again, here's different way to sort of look at the activity system that students did. Here's one for the Navy International Programs Office. Now there's several here where students would, in addition to sort of drawing the interrelationships, they were identifying the different categories. So here, for example, in yellow were the working groups, teams, and cells. The blue with the functional activities, green with the staff characteristics of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. And you'll see the use of different coloring to sort of, now the coloring sort of has to be explained, either in your key like this or in your text, but to explain sort of the different activities you know, in terms of whether is that a goal, is that a theme, is that an activity, you know, sometimes using different colors helps explain that. And you'll see that, by the way, in the reading on what is strategy, in terms of Porter talks about, you know, the activity system maps that he does for IKEA and Southwest and for Vanguard, you know, use different colors for different ideas. Here's Naval Sea Systems Command, Naval Air Systems Command, Naval Air Warfare Center, Training System Division, again, using different colors as well as activity interrelationships. Here's a few that are around themes or sort of goals. You know, here's the JBAB Child Youth Programs, you know, everything from child safety to military readiness and retention, child development. And so you sort of see that in the middle here in these sort of, you know, rounded rectangles are sort of the goals of the organization or objectives, and then the activities that serve those goals are sort of arrayed around. Same thing here. This is the Metro again, Washington Metro, and again, sort of the goals in the middle and the activities that serve those goals are on the outside. Here, the Oasis, the same idea. Here's one that JATO again, you know, similar idea in terms of the different objectives and the activities that support those objectives arrayed around here. Now, the ones before here, for example, you'll notice everything up till now, there hasn't really been sort of, it's been sort of a, there's been no organization, if you will, to the map in terms of where things are located. But you'll remember when I did the Coors and I did the Dell examples, I sort of put these labels across the top just to sort of, you know, it helps me to organize to make sure we're covering all the bases in different activities here. And here's some examples of that. Here's Hilo Sea Combat Squadron 2, and you see across the top procurement, training, maintenance, operations, admin, safety. You know, sort of the activities are arrayed, you know, in these sort of vertical columns in some sense. Another example is Strike Fighter Squadron 122, VSF 122, admin, training, operations, maintenance, safety. Again, getting this idea of, you know, it again can help tell the story even more if you if it helps you to sort of organize it that way. Here's Hilo Maritime Strike Wing Pacific, operations, training, procurement, production, administration. And again, there's a story here. You can, I think this one is posted on Sakai, and you know what the dotted lines mean and everything like that, so you can, you know, see what they mean and they convey different things. Here's the Commander Navy Installations Command, scenic, again, broken into operations management in terms of base support and operating forces, fleet and family readiness, Inspector General. So again, the different activities and relationships there. Here's one where we use both colors, separating you know, localized functional effort versus the shared functional effort. But then also the different columns in terms of manning, training, and equipping for the Commander Naval Air Forces. Again, like I say, there's different ways, just examples of different ways students have used these diagrams or exhibits to tell their story. Of course, another way to represent activities, you know, that I don't get a lot of these, but remember the value chain. The value chain is another way. It doesn't sort of map out the interrelationships, but it is one way to sort of catalog the key distinct activities, what's sort of significant or distinct. I gave you the example of Dell, you know, before, and here's sort of Dell's value chain. You know, here's an example of sort of Walmart's value chain, and another example of Starbucks value chain. And again, the diagram in and of itself is not necessarily important. It's more about sort of making sure you document all of them. And the closest I've sort of gotten a students to this is an example from Naval Air Systems Command, you know, where they really went through and, you know, you don't have to do it in a picture with circles and lines, but, you know, simply identifying the major activity areas, the, you know, roles, the incentives, the information interdependence. Although this, actually, this is, I misspoke. This is actually misplaced. This is actually an external analysis. I apologize. But you can get the idea that you could do the same sort of thing if you know, were to do a table, and just like that, in terms of the activities and identifying what was sort of important, you know, with them. So this is actually, like I say, this is a different way to do the external analysis, not the internal activity analysis. But again, I haven't had any students do a value chain, but it's another way that you could certainly present it. And finally, you know, well, actually, not this is not finally, but one thing is, again, we've sort of the last sort of lessons we've really talked about this idea of when you really want to identify a strategy or a strategic position, the key is in terms of focus and trade-offs. And so I've got a lot of these examples where students, you know, are characterizing their organization strategy in terms of the focus and trade-off. You know, where do you put a greater emphasis on what, at the implicit expense of what. And so I gave you the example in class of the National Maritime Intelligence Center. I also gave the example of the U.S. Maritime Strategy. But here's some of the student analyses, the Joint Base Anacostia Bowling Child Youth Programs, again, areas of focus and the trade-off. And again, the focus has to be, the focus is what you're emphasizing. The trade-off's got to be, something that you're giving up, right? And something that if there's not a real sacrifice, it's really not about strategy. The LCS program here, focus and trade-off. Naval Sea Systems Commands, focus and trade-offs. VX1, HSM Weapons School Pacific Fleet. The Washington Metro Authority, Transportation Authority again. Naval Air Warfare Center, Training Systems Division, again. VSF 122. So a lot of examples there, again, about how identifying OASIS. And lastly, the last sort of slides I want to present, there's a couple here. Again, I don't get a lot of these because I told you it's optional. Applying sort of the idea of anything through the last module in terms of dynamic analysis, is really not necessarily expected. But I have had some students do it. Here's some analysis of the threat to sustained strategic advantage for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. And, from the different external players and, the generic threats you see there of, hold up, imitation, substitution, saturation, slack. And again, obviously this is an exhibit that supported a discussion in the project. And within the project they talked about, these threats. The diagrams, again, in and of themselves don't tell the story, they support the story. And here's again that JADO project. Again, looking at the different potential threats of sustained advantage, from hold up to substitution to saturation to slack, etc. So, all right. So again, there's a lot of different examples there. And I go through those just because I think sometimes when students understand what, I have always sort of feel that, if you can tell it in a picture and then you can explain it, it makes it, more understandable. It helps you process the information you're trying to say. So I leave you with this, and the last thing is just remember these deadlines. The first two are sort of soft deadlines. Well, they're all kind of soft deadlines, but let's try to stick to them. And I want to quickly figure out who your group members are. Maybe you've already done that. Probably many of you already have. Quickly figure out your organization. So hopefully at the end of the last week of class, everybody's at least told me what the organization they want to analyze is, and I've sort of said. I'm not going to necessarily if I don't say anything, that means it's okay. But if it gives me an opportunity to say, well, I'm a little worried about that, as a potential project, and so give you the if there's any warning flags, I can identify those early. And then finally, of course, the completed project is due on June 30th. So again, I'm not sure if this is really helpful or not, but I didn't want everybody to have to go through it. But I will post this on my YouTube site, and then if students want to review it, maybe one from each group might make sense, I guess, then please do. All right. Thank you very much. I'll see you in class this week.